The tumbleweeds have tumbled, the crickets have done chirping, and we, dear listeners, are back.
Woo!
While Surrounded by the Decade was fun and all that, we're getting back properly into the swing of it with the regular, historically nerdy content that you know and, hopefully, love. We do need to say a massive thank you for bearing with us during our term of absence and for continuing to listen. We're nearly at 1,000 listens overall, and that is truly humbling. We appreciate each and every one of you, and whilst we know that our first few episodes are more than a little rough around the edges, we hope that we still entertain you, and more than that you learn a little something from us every time. So, with that in mind, stick the kettle on, make yourself a brew, and let's get historical.
Hey, good to be back. This week we've decided to come back to somewhere closer to home, though not right on our doorsteps this time. We're heading to that there London and to a fortress turned tourist attraction that's as infamous as it is impressive. We're talking, of course, about the Tower of London. Now, I've never been to the Tower of London, though I have got a souvenir from there.
I've been there. I've seen the crown jewels. A lot of it was closed off at the time for refurbishment of upcoming exhibits, but when I saw it was impressive enough. My brother has since been, and he says it's awesome now, and he brought me this really cool goblet back, which is pretty awesome. So maybe a visit's in order?
Maybe. Whilst it is hard to believe with the mod cons of electricity, facilities, holographic displays, the tower is one of the oldest landmarks in the country, with a rich history spanning nearly 900 years. After the Battle of Hastings in 1066, William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, needed to consolidate his hold over his new kingdom, moving on from Canterbury and erecting fortifications along the way. London at the time was a Saxon stronghold, so William needed to sort that out first, really. He entered the city via Southwark and was sweeping through.
Southwark?
Yes.
Southwark.
Does it matter?
I'm sorry, you're the one who corrected me when I said Costacy, and it was Cossey.
Because it is Cossey.
But there's a T in there.
We said we weren't going to do close to home. It is a Norfolk town called Cossey.
Okay, but it's Southwark. Sorry. As you were.
They effectively blockaded the city, cutting off supply lines until the Saxons could hold out no longer, and in December of 1066 they yielded the city of London to William's armies without technically even fighting for it. Within the following 21 years, a massive project of fortification was undertaken across the whole of England, and a total of 36 castles were built by William, with many more being built by his underlings. We know this because of the Domesday Book. And we'll probably talk in more detail about that when we actually speak about William himself.
Yeah, he was quite an interesting character, and his courtship of Matilda was interesting and mildly playground, to say the least.
Somewhat. But yeah, by this point, London had already been established as the de facto capital of the country, and so it was pretty important for the Normans to have a stronghold here to consolidate their power and assert their control over the city. You know, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Romans had founded what was then Londinium and had built walls around the city. These were used as a basis on which to construct what would later become known as the Tower of London. The White Tower, which is the central keep of the complex, was started possibly in 1078, though nobody is quite sure of the exact date. I mean, it was quite a long time ago. You got to give them a little bit of slack.
Yeah, exactly.
Construction was monitored by the Bishop of Rochester, a chap called Gundulf.
Not Gandalf?
Not Gandalf, Gundulf.
Okay.
Though it is believed that William died before seeing it being completed. So we can hazard an educated guess that it was finished and at least partially furnished by 1100s, when it was used as a prison by Bishop Ranulph Flambard.
Flambard was being held there because of taxes that he unduly imposed on the people of England, and he's actually the first recorded prisoner of the Tower, though by no means the last or most famous. Oddly enough, he also holds the distinction of being the first person to escape from the Tower, using rope smuggled in a cask of wine. All things considered, captivity in the Tower wasn't too bad for Bishop Flambard. He was allowed to keep servants, and his surroundings were fairly luxurious. A cage is still a cage, however, and on the 2nd of February 1101, he had the rope smuggled in using wine for a banquet that he hosted for his captors. When they were all hopelessly drunk, he used the rope to lower himself out of the Tower and escaped. In the reign of William II, A stone wall was erected around the White Tower, strengthening it from within. A constable was appointed in the form of Geoffrey de Mandeville to look after the castle and the city in general. During the period known as the Anarchy, Mandeville, still called Geoffrey but not the same fellow, it was his son, switched sides a few times and gained an inordinate amount of power. He actually became possibly the most powerful man in England at that point. Unfortunately, his reach did exceed his grasp and he was arrested. From that point on, the constable was appointed by the Crown, and later the position of lieutenant to the Tower was created to help the constable out on his duties. Eventually, the creation of the Lord Mayor of London position took over the civic side of the constable's power. It wasn't always a harmonious relationship, mind you, but for the most part, between the Lord Mayor and the constable, it worked.
Yay.
The wall provided the main fortification for the Tower until the reign of Richard I, when his Lord Chancellor, William Longchamp, tried to add a moat that he hoped to fill by diverting water from the Thames. That didn't really go to plan, though there is a dry moat still present today, but we'll come back to that one later. When Prince John attempted to seize control in his brother's absence, he laid siege to the Tower in October 1191. The siege lasted a grand total of 3 days before Longchamp surrendered. It was later besieged again in 1214 when Prince John was then King John. He had a bit of an issue with some of his barons, you might have heard of that.
A little.
But once he signed this little slip of paper called the Magna Carta, the siege was lifted. The Tower remained under the control of Robert Fitzwalter, who had led the siege, and after the death of John in 1216, it played a part in the conflict to decide who would be king after him, his son Henry III or Prince Louis of France. Spoilers, it was Henry. He then extended the castle, followed by his successor Edward I, and it still stands pretty much the same today. It was in 1240 that the tradition of whitewashing the main keep began, thus earning it the name we still use today, the White Tower. Literally because it's painted white. It's inventive.
Yep.
It expanded past the original Roman walls and became quite a formidable fortress, although this wasn't always exactly popular with the locals. I mean, it was a place from which they were often oppressed and taxed and treated meanly, although it did actually become a bit of a refuge for the local Jewish population until they were later kicked out.
Aww.
Yeah, and then there was this act that basically got rid of all Jews in the country. But then they came back. But that's why you'll always find Jewish populations around castles, because the castles used to be, when they were persecuted, where they were going for protection.
Oh, nice little tidbit there from Carrie.
You're welcome.
A second moat was dug by Henry III and later filled by Edward I as part of a programme of remodelling costing approximately £21,000, which was an insane amount of money then. I mean, It's not a small amount now, but it was an insane amount then.
Yeah. I mean, like, we moan about what happened with Frogmore Cottage. Just imagine the taxpayers' money going towards that.
Well,
yeah.
It became a formidable prison, though probably not the most secure one. Guards were often bribed, escape attempts were regular and successful. Some not so much, but we'll explain at the end of this episode.
Okay.
The tower was then renovated again by Edward III, and later, in 1377, it was used by the then newly crowned Richard II as the first part of the royal route to Westminster Abbey for his coronation. This was setting a new tradition which would see future monarchs staying in the tower the lead up to their coronations.
Mm-hmm.
It was a tradition that wasn't always lucky, but we'll come back to that. Whilst at that point, not exactly the main location of the crown jewels, mainly as they technically weren't a major thing then,
yeah.
It still held a number of jewels that belonged to the crown. These were looted in 1381 when Richard II rode out to meet Wat Tyler.
What?
Exactly. Wat Tyler was the leader of the Peasants' Revolt.
Who?
Wat Tyler. He was the leader of the Peasants' Revolt, who had besieged the castle when Richard was in it. The mob also dragged Simon Sudbury, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, from St John's Chapel, breaking the rules of sanctuary and beheading him on the nearby Tower Hill.
They broke sanctuary.
I know they did,
No.
Naughty, naughty people. Far from being a refuge, Richard II was later imprisoned and later died there, allowing Henry IV to come to power. He held James I of Scotland prisoner there, and his son Henry V held a few prominent prisoners from his French victories, such as Agincourt. The Wars of the Roses saw a lot of back and forth between refuge, palace and prison for the tower, having it besieged in 1460 by Yorkists where artillery fire damaged part of the tower. Now, you said to me when we were researching this, that would you think of the 1400s having artillery power?
Not really, no. But guns were a pretty big thing, and they fitted some castles with gun loops to hold them. And you don't think. I mean, I said, would you think of artillery? You said no. I'd think of swords.
Yeah.
Which were the main things. You know, a bunch of men in armour hacking each other with swords.
It's pretty much what you think of
peasants with
medieval warfare. Yeah.
Yeah. But apparently not in that time. No, they had guns.
Fascinating, genuinely.
Yeah.
When Edward IV took the throne back again from an increasingly feeble Henry VI, now without the support of Richard Neville, see our Wars of the Roses episode,
Plug.
and they imprisoned him in the tower where he died. Whether or not he was murdered isn't known for sure, but he probably was, let's be honest.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Following the siege, new fortifications were added and the tower was fitted for cannons and guns.
Yep.
But probably the most infamous part of the tower's history, and the most contentious, happened around this time. After the death of Edward IV, his son, also called Edward, was taken by his brother Richard, along with his other son, also called Richard.
Confusing much?
Yeah. But they were taken to the tower for their own safety, and supposedly to await the coronation of the future King Edward V.
That was a done thing, so it was expected.
Yeah. However, a decree was then made confirming that the marriage of the late King Edward IV to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, and the children were illegitimate.
Dun, dun, dun.
Richard III then took the throne, and the young princess seemingly just completely vanished. Flash forward to 1674, and during the demolition of the entrance to the White Tower, 2 sets of bones were found believed to belonging to children. It was then assumed that they were the remains of the princes, and they were swiftly reinterred at Westminster Abbey. Royal is where they need to go. Despite many requests, the current monarchy has refused to allow these remains to be tested to check who they may really belong to. Suspicious much?
If they've got nothing to hide, they should let them be tested.
Yeah,
that's my take on it.
I do believe that they were the princes. I don't believe that Richard was involved.
No.
I think it was his wife, personally. I think she did it.
I think it was either her or Henry Tudor and Margaret Beaufort. I think they're the ones that had the most to gain. I mean, Richard already had everything at that point.
Yeah, but he still had these 2 that had more of a legitimate claim when they got older.
Yeah, that's very true. But they were already illegitimate in the eyes of the country and the church. So they could only be made if they were legitimised.
Yeah, didn't stop like Henry VIII and such.
Yeah, but he then had the active succession.
It's because he's a bay. Anyway.
During the Tudor period, the tower was used less as a royal residence and more as a prison and armoury. In the early 1500s, the yeoman warders were created. They were more of a royal bodyguard at the time, and they were actually used as bodyguard for Anne Boleyn when she stayed there before her coronation. It was all remodelled. It was improved during Henry VIII's reign. Admittedly, it was focused more on defence and fortifications and residential works, although it was not as strong a fortress as some other castles in England. The state of the tower declined quite a lot after Henry VIII's death, and it was only really used by monarchs to stay in prior to coronation, or when it would be symbolically useful to them to do so. It got to the stage where it wasn't really somewhere you'd want to live as a whole. It was in such bad disrepair. That's how it's developed its reputation as a terrifying prison. It was mostly used for high-profile prisoners, such as ones that committed treason or high treason, which is treason against the crown, against the monarchy. And we'll give a quick list of some of the more notable names who stayed there and who also died there. As with a few prisons during the Stuart and Georgian eras, you could pay to have conditions improved through purchasing decent food, furniture and tapestries, though if you ran out of money this could easily be taken away again by the guards. Despite the reputation, the prisoners in the tower weren't tortured as often as you'd think, mainly because the use of torture had to be approved by the Privy Council, which was a lot of red tape and paperwork. According to historic records, there were actually less than 50 recorded cases of the use of torture between 1540 and 1640.
Oh, that's what, 50 in 100 years?
Yeah.
Wow.
Basically, that's like 1 every 2 years.
Yeah.
If you think about the amount of people that were imprisoned in the tower during that time, it doesn't really add up. The rack was possibly the most notorious device used. If you've listened to our gunpowder plot episode,
plug in,
and seen the cover picture for it on our Instagram, you'll see just how effective torture devices such as the rack were. Despite what you might think, though, executions weren't often carried out at the tower itself, but actually on the nearby Tower Hill. It was only really the people for whom it was believed public execution would be too big a risk, so like uprising, stone public spirit, things like that, they had the honour of a Tower Green execution.
Prior to the English Civil War in the 17th century, the alliances of the Tower had already changed. From royalists to parliamentarian, following it being ceded to Parliament by Sir John Byron, the then Lieutenant of the Tower on command of Charles I. So it was already in their hands when the Civil War broke out in 1642. Oddly enough, Charles II was the last monarch to follow the tradition of processing from the Tower to Westminster Abbey for his coronation after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, though he didn't stop in the Tower the night before because it was in such bad condition. During the Stuart era, the Tower was remodelled, a new storehouse was built in the inner ward. It was further repaired during the Hanoverian era, mainly because their hold on the crown was a bit tenuous at first.
Well, yeah, they were German.
Well, yeah. Although there wasn't a huge focus on defences, and the number of guns that flanked the tower's defences was cut by almost 2/3.
Yeah, it went down from something like 118 to 45. So that's a big drop in the amount of guns you got.
Yeah, a new gateway was added in 1774, and in 1830, the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, of the Battle of Waterloo fame,
Name drop.
had the moat cleared because of a silt build-up. On the one hand, it helped. On the other, it didn't work fast enough, as there was a deadly disease outbreak due to the polluted water supply in 1841. In the end, a decision was taken to drain the moat and fill it with earth, which took about 2 years to finish. And you can see the result now. It's still, that's what's there nowadays. Some of the yeoman warders walk their dogs around the moat.
One of the perks of living in the tower, I guess.
Isn't it? It looks nice and green.
Well, yeah, it's going to be quite fertile, all that silt and river water.
Yep. The Waterloo Barracks were added in 1845 and is now the headquarters to the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. The tower's dark side resurfaced during the First World War when it was used as a prison and a site of execution by firing squads for spies. This happened again during the Second World War, and the last execution was carried out on the 15th of August 1941 when Josef Jakobs, a German spy, was shot. They still have the chair he was shot in. You can see the marks from the bullets that passed through him.
Yeah, there's little chunks of the chair that have been blown away.
Since the war, it has become a tourist attraction and is one of the must-see locations in London for foreign visitors, and one of the most visited and popular attractions in the country. Technically, tourists have been visiting since the end of the Tudor period, and as well as the crown jewels, people have been drawn by the collections of the royal armour, including that was worn by Henry VIII.
With the codpiece still attached.
Here's my bay.
It is an impressive codpiece. I mean, normally I look at the armour as a whole, but that thing will have your eye out.
He did have 6 wives.
True.
There was also a royal menagerie from the original outlying structure, so not the White Tower. Only 2 of the towers survived, the Wakefield and the St Thomas Towers. The rest have been repurposed or demolished. Slowly but surely, important institutions were moved out during the mid-Victorian era, including the Royal Mint.
So it's basically gone from being the massive fortress where everything was in there to bit by bit things moving out.
Yeah.
Now it's mostly a tourist attraction and home to the crown jewels.
Well, to be fair, you don't want to put everything in one place.
This is true.
During the First World War, the tower largely escaped harm. A bomb landed, sure, but it landed in the dry moat. It wasn't so lucky in the Second World War, and on the 23rd of September 1940, a number of bombs hit and took out a number of prominent buildings within the castle grounds. Luckily, the White Tower narrowly escaped.
Okay.
A suspected IRA attack in 1974 scarred the White Tower when a bomb in the mortar room killed 1 person and left 41 injured, although technically nobody has claimed responsibility for that attack.
Yeah, it's suspected IRA. Like, the police are pretty sure it was IRA, but nobody's come forward and said definitely, yeah, it was us.
Yeah.
Whilst the Fusiliers still call the tower home, the majority of military activity, aside from ceremonial stuff, has left the tower, and tourism is now the main focus. It was added to the UNESCO list of World Heritage Sites in 1988, and since then all the skyscrapers that have come around it have actually put it onto the list of UNESCO endangered heritage sites. The remains of the medieval palace have been open to visitors for the last 14 years. The constable is still appointed within the tower, though it is largely a ceremonial position, and the yeoman warders, or beefeaters, are still a familiar sight around the tower, and they're one of the most iconic things about London.
Definitely.
Though their roles now include tour guides. They're very well trained, incredibly informed at that, and they go through rigorous training and extensive testing to take on the prestigious position. They are also all exclusively ex-servicemen and now women.
Yay!
Whilst the crown jewels as a whole are kept within the walls of the tower since the mid-13th century, they weren't really accessible or admissible for viewing by the paying public until after the restoration of the monarchy. There was a slight blip in 1671 when Colonel Thomas Blood tried to steal them. It didn't quite go to plan, but Charles II actually rewarded him for his audacity.
Didn't he get like a big old house and estate and stuff?
Yeah, and land and money and everything. Charles was
you,
just like...
You, fine sir, had the bollocks to try and steal my crown.
Yeah, I like this man. He has cojones.
I am impressed by this man. Here, have an estate.
The menagerie at the tower is believed to have been started by King John, with records showing that he might have kept lions there. It wasn't until Henry III that we have more solid records of it, however. Animals kept there over the centuries have included leopards gifted by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a polar bear given by King Haakon IV of Norway that actually used to go fishing in the Thames. So imagine
polar bear lived all right in the UK.
Yeah, it lived fine. It caught fish from the Thames and everything. Well, don't forget, at that point, in the winter, the Thames would frequently freeze over.
Oh yeah, we were chillier.
Yeah, we were a lot colder. But just imagine pootling your way through London, minding your own business, going to market, and all of a sudden you just see a polar bear in the river. You say, oh, okay.
Fair one.
An African elephant from Louis IX of France that was fed with red wine. Didn't survive very long. There are also records of lynxes, jackals, hyenas, and bears. So at one point, the ambient sounds of central London must have been quite interesting. There have also been birds such as eagles, owls, and of course, ravens. The menagerie was officially closed down in 1831, and most of the animals removed to the newly opened London Zoo, which opened in 1828, and a few were moved instead to Regent's Park as well. Evidence of animal remains and cages have been found in various archaeological excavations, and statues made of a fine wire have been erected around the tower grounds in homage to the animals.
Oh, that's sweet.
The ones that do remain, however, are the ravens. There are always a group of at least 6 captive ravens at the tower at all times, and looking after them is one of the most important roles at the tower. The reason? A superstition, possibly Victorian in origin, though nobody quite knows, that if the ravens all die or fly away, the crown and Britain shall fall.
We love a good superstition here in the UK.
It's believed that ravens have inhabited the tower since the reign of Charles II, under the care of the official Raven Master. There is some notion that the tradition actually goes back a little further to the Celtic era, when the king, Bran the Blessed, was decapitated and his head buried beneath the White Hill on which the tower now stands, facing France to protect his kingdom from foreign invasion. The link? Bran is the Welsh/Briton word for raven. Think on that one, Game of Thrones fans. And ravens are magical and symbols of protection in Celtic mythology. So as long as there are ravens, we are protected.
Britain shall not fall.
We do well. We do well. We need ravens. Ravens everywhere. Let's just get ravens.
Let's do it.
There.
So that, in a nutshell, is the history of the tower. We've tried to keep it as brief as possible because our last episode was quite a long one. We would recommend that you visit the tower though. If you live here or are just visiting, it's worth seeing as an example of living history and a record of how this country and its alliances, both religious and political, have changed and shaped it. You'll notice we haven't really mentioned many names of the prisoners, so here is a quick rundown of some being the optimum word, because there's quite a few, of the most notorious residents and executions at the tower. So the first person, like we said before, was Ranulph Flambard, the Bishop of Durham. He was the first to be in prison and the first to escape in 1101.
John Balliol, a Scottish king that was imprisoned by Edward I.
And they got Lady Jane Grey, who obviously was named to succeed Edward VI. However, she was only queen for 9 days. Lady
Elizabeth, imprisoned on the 17th of March 1554. Obviously she was released because she then later became Queen Elizabeth I.
Yep, Queen Anne Boleyn.
Oh,
a moment for mine. She was hard done by, I believe. She arrived via Traitor's Gate from the River Thames on the 2nd of May 1536, and she was executed on the Tower Green on the 19th of May of the same year. She does, apparently, still haunt the grounds to this day.
To be fair, considering her husband /king/executioner, then married his new wife 11 days later, and was playing tennis at the time she was executed. I get why she'd still be a bit peeved and want to hang around.
Yeah.
William Wallace, imprisoned and executed shortly after in 1305. His head was then displayed on a spike on London Bridge.
He was one of the ones that was, like, tortured.
Yeah, he was crushed. He basically had a board put on top of him and then stones put on top of the board until his back broke and all his organs were... And then he was cut open and had his organs pulled out and then chopped into pieces, and his body was sent to all four corners, and his head was in London Bridge. It was gory, I want to say.
Somewhat. I'd say somewhat.
Yeah, he was dead. He was definitely dead.
Yeah, there's no coming back from that one.
No.
John II of France in 1356, after the Battle of...
Poitiers.
You would give me the French sounding words. He
It
was
is French.
released after his ransom was paid, but sadly died at the Savoy in 1364.
Not the actual Savoy Hotel,
Well,
it's
no.
just like Savoy, I think it's Savoy Palace or something there. Richard II of England in 1399, before later being removed to Pontefract Castle, where he was murdered. I mean, it's quite sad.
I know.
He was shot full of arrows.
I was just letting the dramatic effect.
Ah, thanks.
James I of Scotland was there in 1406, but then transferred to Nottingham Castle.
The family of famous Welsh rebel Owen Glendower. See, I didn't make you read that one.
I could have read that one though. Thanks,
True, you
Horrible
could.
Histories.
Owen Glendower in 1409, following his defeat at the hands of Henry IV.
Margaret of Anjou was there after the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1477, and she remained there until her ransom was paid.
George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence in 1477, privately executed for treason in 1478.
Edward V and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury in 1483, though their deaths are still one of the biggest history mysteries, technically.
Yeah, I mean, what we can say for certain, sitting right here in 2020, they're dead.
They are no longer alive.
No. Edward Plantagenet, 17th Earl Warwick, imprisoned in 1485 and executed 1499.
Sir William Stanley, imprisoned for treason in 1495 and executed at Tower Hill.
For all the Ricardian fans out there, vindication! Sorry. Composed. Perkin Warbeck, pretending to be one of the princes in the Tower, imprisoned in 1497 and executed in 1499 after trying to escape with his alleged cousin, Edward Earl Warwick.
Sir William de la Pole, he was held there for 37 years, from 1502, to become the longest held prisoner.
Bishop Fisher, Bishfish, now Saint Fisher.
Bishfish.
Bishfish. we came up when we were watching the Tudors, we kept calling him Bishfish. Sorry.
Bishfish.
Imprisoned on the 22nd of June, 1535.
Sir Thomas More, also now a saint, was imprisoned on the 17th of April 1534 and executed and buried at the Tower on the 6th of July 1535 for treason.
Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, imprisoned 1539 and beheaded 1541 for treason. She was actually the sister of Edward Earl Warwick, and they were both the children of George, Duke of Clarence. Did not go well being in the Tower for that family.
No, not great. Thomas Cromwell was imprisoned and executed in 1540.
Queen Catherine Howard, imprisoned and executed in 1542.
Thomas Howard in 1547, though later pardoned in 1553. Edward Seymour and Thomas Cranmer in 1553, who was burnt at the stake in 1554 for heresy in Oxford.
We mentioned Lady Jane Grey earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Her husband, Guildford Dudley, he was executed at the same time as her on the 12th of February 1544.
Well, at least they died together.
Yeah, I mean, she watched him die first.
But she didn't even want to be queen. Like, that's completely unfair.
Yeah.
Henry Wotherby, Earl of Southampton, was imprisoned from October 1571 to May 1573 for the Ridolfi plot to assassinate Elizabeth I and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. His son, also named Henry, because they like to make things confusing, was later imprisoned in 1601 for his part in the Essex Rebellion, but was released by James I in 1603.
Sir Walter Raleigh stayed there in relative comfort for 13 years from 1603, and he even grew tobacco on Tower Green.
Fair one. Guy Fawkes was interrogated there. Then he was to be hung, drawn and quartered at the old palace yard. Other co-conspirators were also imprisoned following the failed gunpowder plot.
Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist who documented the fire of London, was imprisoned for maladministration for 6 weeks in 1679.
Maladministration?
Yeah. The diarist did not keep accurate records.
Irony. So Robert Walpole was imprisoned for corruption in 1712. He then went on to become the first Prime Minister, born in King's Lynn.
Yeah. I just love the fact that he was in prison for corruption, then became Prime Minister.
That surprises you, honestly?
There were a number of Jacobites involved in the 1715 and 1745 uprisings, including Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, William Maxwell Earl Nithsdale, Sir John Douglas, Baronet Kilhead, and Flora MacDonald, who helped Bonnie Prince Charlie escape to the Isle of Skye after the Battle of Culloden.
Rudolf Hess, deputy leader of the Nazi Party, was there in May 1941.
And two chaps you may just have heard of.
Possibly.
Ronnie and Reggie Cray, the Cray twins, were the last people held in the tower for a few days in 1952 for failing to report to national service. Pity for some that they were then released.
Unfortunate.
Okay, that is the history of the tower, and that was some, and not even remotely half, of all of the famous prisoners there.
But they're the ones that most people have heard of.
Yeah, we kind of, cherry-picked them. So now, on to our ridiculous death.
Yay!
We kind of have a ridiculous death and a ridiculous prelude to death.
Yeah.
First off, we have Griffith ap Llywelyn Fawr.
No way was I saying that.
He was a Welsh prince, and even though he was the oldest, he was the illegitimate eldest son of Llywelyn Fawr, meaning Llywelyn the Great, who is King of Wales. He was imprisoned in 1241. In 1244, he decided to try and escape out the window by tying a load of bedsheets together. Perfectly acceptable, you know. Flambard did it with rope. He could do it with bedsheets.
Mm-hmm.
Flambard calculated the amount of rope he would need. Griffith ap Llywelyn did not. I think it was about 10 feet or so, not a massive amount, enough to potentially break bones if he landed wrong. Drop left. He dropped. He did not land right. Landed on his head, broke his neck, died.
He died because of miscalculation.
Yeah, he was basically trying to escape an imprisonment where he could potentially be executed by dying.
That would have hurt as well.
I mean, it would have been quick. Let's face
Yeah,
it.
but he would have known.
Yeah, in that last second.
I think out of that, I would have rather have had my head chopped off than breaking my neck.
I mean, I would say the last thought going through his mind was, oh shit, but the last thing going through his mind was probably the ground.
Yeah, that was really lame.
That was dark. Sorry. And executions were often a spectacle.
Yeah, they were like public entertainment, weren't they?
Yeah, and sometimes they would go wrong. I mean, Mary Queen of Scots, her head got basically hacked off because the executioner was shoddy. That's why you paid the executioner beforehand. You forgave him, but you also paid him to say, basically, make it a quick job. When they pulled her head up, her wig came off and her head fell on the floor, and apparently the lips were still muttering in prayer. So that would have been disturbing on a couple of counts. But what was disturbing was just before they died, Margaret Pole, she didn't want to die, obviously.
Yeah, especially that way.
So as the axeman pulled back his axe, ready to go for it, she stood up and legged it. And basically, for a couple of minutes, all the crowd would have seen was Margaret Pole running round and round and round the executioner's block with the axeman chasing after her, swinging for her, until she was caught and put down and then her head chopped off.
Well, you know, you got to give a girl props for trying.
I mean, it's a really, really dark comedy sketch, but let's be honest, if you were there, what would your reaction be? Would you be rooting for her? I mean,
I don't really. I think I'd be more like, what are you doing?
It's just like, it's going to happen anyway.
Did she actually think she'd be able to outrun him? Because she didn't even go anywhere. She just ran in a circle.
Well, she couldn't really run because there were guards either side. Probably all standing there going, what?
So she just literally decided to go for a little jog.
Yeah, she just basically just stood up, hitched up her skirts, chanced it and ran, hoping...
In a circle?
Yeah, round and round the block. Sorry, Margaret Pole, I shouldn't laugh because you were obviously scared, in a lot of distress. Really?
That is a little bit ridiculous.
So, the death wasn't ridiculous, but that I just had to
that
share
bit
that.
was ridiculous. That needs to be said. It was at the tower, and it's funny. So
Right. So that is the Tower of London, complete with all its ridiculousness.
yeah.
So we are going to say goodnight. We're going to tuck the ravens away and go our separate ways.
You made it sound like we're splitting up.
The band is breaking up. No, I mean just like we're doing stuff.
I'll speak, or we're just going and we'll speak to you in a week.
We'll go our separate ways to the listeners. Listeners will go and do their things, and we'll go. Yeah.
Just say bye, Carrie.
Bye.